Persona has an interesting set of spin-offs, which makes it weird considering the fact that Persona itself is a spin-off of Shin Megami Tensei. You have a fighting game, some dancing games, and now a Dynasty Warriors clone. I think Persona has itself covered in the realm of potential ideas for what its games can be. Persona 5 Strikers released back in February of this year. It's an action RPG that takes a lot from Dynasty Warriors. And compared to other Dynasty Warriors clones, there's a surprising amount of content here. I can only say there was probably one part of this entire game that I didn't like as much. This video will act as a full breakdown of the game. We'll be discussing story, gameplay, and everything in between. If you want my simple review of the game, then I say that Strikers is one of the best games of the year so far, and great for anyone who is a fan of Persona and action RPGs. The major question to ask when starting this game is how it stands in comparison to Persona 5 and Royal, and the answer is pretty simple. This feels like a full sequel to Persona 5. The characters are still the same, so is the world. In fact, the first 3 levels take a bit more time to explore some of the characters. Those levels that I just spoke about are actually called the jails, and they replace the palaces in this game. One quick thing that you'll notice is that most of these don't have any interior locations for you to run around in. You only really do so in the last bit of each jail, so all of the exploration is done outside with enemies scattered around for you to fight. The one thing I will say about each jail is that while they look different, I wish that they all had their own gameplay ideas. Stealth isn't even that useful in this game, and that's because Joker's gun can essentially ambush enemies from any distance, something that you'll be using a lot. Sadly, none of the other characters got this skill, well, except for Haru. So anyway, I think it's about time that we got into combat, which is probably the biggest difference from the turn-based combat of the previous game. I think Atlas did a perfect job in translating combat over from Persona 5 into this game. Spells and physical attacks activate quickly and will have an immediate response when attacking enemies. The one trait from Persona 5 that I loved that continued to happen in this game was how quickly battles could begin and then end. Simply memorizing enemy weaknesses can allow you to quickly pull off a spell that can end the battle as quickly as possible, all just to trigger an all-out attack. Enemies will come at you in hordes. Sometimes you'll be fighting the same enemy, or sometimes you'll be fighting a large grouping of enemies. It's also great how each character has their own special set of skills and abilities for you to play with. Makoto and An can enchant their weapons with their individual elements, so even if they're out of stamina, you can still do significant damage, especially to enemies weak to those elements. Haru and Morgana are more based on constant moves that require you to hold down a button so it can continue happening for as long as it can, like Haru's infinite ammo or Morgana's ability to turn into a car. Both for Yuji and Yusuke are both about positioning and making sure that each attack lands exactly where you want it to. Ryuji can charge up his skills and unleash a powerful blow, while Yusuke can stick in place and rapidly slash his sword. The two new characters, Sophia and Senkichi, are based around range, and I don't mean aiming, it's more about how their weapons allow for their attacks to reach enemies regardless of how far they are. Like how Senkichi will send flying attacks away from his sword, and Sophia will increase the range of her yo-yos. Joker is both the most simple and the most versatile character to play as, since he can effectively use any skill in the game by switching personas. Most of his attacks revolve around how you choose to end his combos. The best way in my opinion is to end it by shooting your opponent so you get a follow-up attack that allows you to start your combo over from the start. So battles have a strong sense of variety since each player may take the time to learn every single character individually. Then there are the Showtime attacks, which are a fun way to decimate a large group of enemies. Yusuke's is personally my favorite. And while all of that is fun, I think I should probably talk about the minor issues that I have with the combat system. Nothing about it is really bad, there are just some things that are off. As with any RPG, getting weapons, armor, and items is very important. The game has you going from city to city throughout the story, and each of these locations have their own set of shops that will sell items to you. There is also the secondary shop, which is provided by Sophia, that can only be accessed at the hideout. So the game incentivizes you to stock up on these items at any given time. On my second playthrough, I would hoard any cooking ingredients because cooking at the hideout grants the best items for healing stamina. In fact, cooking might as well be the only way to get items that replenish stamina because any other shop in the game gives you so little. I think the game was intentionally designed around the players being able to have so many items at once, because enemies will hit you like a fucking truck at the beginning of this game. I'm not even joking here, look at this. This is my first time playing as Morgana, and this is what happens.
Sorry.
Having so many items and the ability to pause the game in order to use them meant that the enemies could be as strong as they possibly wanted. But in the beginning of the game, I was always running into one core issue. The first few jails barely provide you any money in order to buy the materials that you need for combat. I'm not exaggerating when I say that I didn't have the best possible gear for the entire team until the last dungeon. And I'm not talking ultimate weapons or gear. I'm talking the best possible gear that could have been purchased for them at the given time. They tried to alleviate this by having the request system, which are basically side quests that have their own objectives and rewards. These requests are fun, but to me they mostly just feel like distractions from the main game. With a certain set of requests that we'll be talking about later, most of them are just go here and kill a few enemies, or go here and get this item. I have fun with these, but most of them just felt like busy work that could have been done at any point during my first run through a jail. Except most of the requests are actually given to you after you complete a jail. I think these were meant to act as a much more interesting way of grinding, because you'll constantly be getting rewards and fighting enemies at the same time. I don't think this works for the exact same reason why I don't like grinding in the first place. You'll be fighting all these lower level enemies to get the same amount of XP you were getting before. The crazy thing is that this was only a problem for the first set of jails. Once you get to the last 2 or 3, this problem goes away. It's also where battles become the most balanced, and I don't mean in difficulty. Like I said earlier, these last jails will have you facing off against multiple types of enemies at once, as opposed to the earlier jails which only have you fighting one type of enemy. This feels backwards to me. I think that the earlier jails could have had large groups of enemies of different types, and the later jails could have had the smaller yet more powerful enemies to fight. I think the most effective way to have grinding feel a bit more fun is to have some sort of randomized arena within each of the jails. Have there be a separate version of the jail you can enter. It will spawn random battles as well as bosses that you can fight as you attempt to complete some objectives. Also, by having this arena where you can just endlessly fight enemies, you give the players more reason to engage in combat. I think that so many action games could benefit from something like this, and some already do. There's a moment in the beginning of the game where Joker has to face off against a large crowd of enemies by himself, and it's really fun. There are also numerous times in each jail where Futaba will require you to protect her while she hacks a terminal so you can move on. Here you have to watch out for her health while you take on a large group of enemies, but I think that the best thing these moments do is that they essentially give you the chance to play around with the combat as much as you want. This leads to my last problem I have with combat, or a more conflicting one, boss battles. In my opinion, Striker has 2 really great bosses and others that range from good to bad. The bosses are the best example of everything that combat does right and wrong. For all the things that are right, we have to talk about how each encounter works. All bosses will have a mixture of physical and magical attacks. You dodge around these in order to evade damage while finding the best time to strike back. Simple stuff. The fun is in how it's presented to you, running away from a spell that's tracking you or jumping at the right time as a boss slams into the ground as the whole team jumps, which you feels awesome. Konoe, the best boss in the game, is the perfect example of how this system works. Not every character in the game is going to work for this fight, but the ones that do allow for such tight navigation in this battle. Konoe's moves are fast and easy to respond to. It's the first battle in the game where I feel the urge to react before blasting off a spell or a showtime, whereas the reactions for most battles will usually be the same. Konoe solves this by having attacks that don't range across the entire battlefield in his second phase. Other bosses have spells that essentially fire in every general direction in front of them, making it more difficult to evade, mostly because you'll be up close in them trying to deal damage. And that is the first point for all the things that aren't right in boss battles. Another is how I don't think you'll be able to do full combos because you'll most likely be knocked back trying to do them. Haru and the third main boss of the game are the best example of this. Since Beauty Thief requires you to stand in place and hold a button for most of her combos, there is a chance that this boss will pull off any one of its attacks and essentially knock you out of it automatically, then knock you down again before you even have the chance to get back up. Which is a problem because every enemy has the ability to stun you and they'll continue to attack you before you get the chance to get back up. Okay, before we move on to the story, there's one last thing we need to talk about. The Reaper is the perfect boss to further explain the ins and outs of the combat system. First I should explain how getting to the Reaper works. So there are basically 8 jails in the game, and each one of them will have 2 sets of side quest bosses for you to fight. So 16 in total. The Dire Shadows are ones that you can find inside the jail as you explore them. The other types are the request shadows that Lavinza herself asks you to deal with. You also have the Painful Pass requests. This is where you have to refight all of the mainline bosses of the game, which you have to do again after you beat the game with the Painful Pass Plus requests. These legendary Pokemon all range from being hard to fucking ridiculous. Minus the Reaper for a reason that we'll be talking about in a minute. The first point I want to say is that I don't think you can actually fight them until you've completed the game. Obviously they have their own set of weaknesses and every single one of them minus the Reaper fights exactly like one of the mainline bosses. Which is why I want to show you what most of my time with bosses look like in this game.
Oh, nice, Joker! You hit its weakness! You're doing great!
I had to use the tactic of spamming spells for 2 reasons. The first is what we said earlier. These enemies can knock you down with a single attack, or at worst they can kill you with one. Second is that you won't know that you won't be level appropriate to fight them until after you beat the game. So unless you leave behind all these potentially fun fights, or you grind, your standard attacks are going to do nothing to these bosses. Also, I realized that if you break one of the enemy shields, you can essentially knock them out of some of their attacks, which is something that you will realize and are going to start utilizing. Now, none of the battles are bad because of any of those reasons. I think that any battles where the enemy could fly or teleport had the chance to be 50% better. Seth, Yatagasuru, and Metatron are the best examples of this. In fact, Seth is actually the first request shadow that you'll face. I said that he's like a flying version of Konoe considering the fact that all of his attacks feel natural to move around. Metatron within himself feels like a secondary final boss. His spells cover such a large range and he also has the ability to summon other powerful enemies to fight with him. And since he can teleport around, it makes the battle a lot more frantic. But let's finally talk about the Reaper. The Reaper is the only boss in the game that has absolutely no weaknesses or resistances. So you might be wondering how I got through this fight without spamming spells. Well, the answer is simple, and it's something that everyone is going to learn when they get here. The Reaper has all the strongest elemental spells in the game. So your best choice is to stay as Joker and constantly swap personas that either nullify or drain whatever attack is coming at you. Doing this made the battle an intense ride of constantly swapping personas every 5 seconds, getting hit, and then unloading whatever damage I could on the Reaper. It's really crazy that this is the only fight that did this. This battle was 20 straight minutes of swapping personas over and over again, which is why I think it's one of the best fights in the whole game. And that's all I really have to say about combat. Overall, I think it's probably the best part of the entire game. I love the idea of the request shells because I wanted some games to give me more bosses to fight. And with all that concluded, let's finally talk about the story. Okay, let's get to the fucking story of this piece. This is the part of the game where you realize that they're actually trying to make this feel like a full sequel to Persona 5 instead of just making it something you can ignore. Everything begins when Joker gets a message to meet up with everyone at LeBlanc for summer vacation. We also learn that there was another change of heart epidemic going on that isn't connected to the Phantom Thieves. The police decide to do the obvious and blame the Phantom Thieves for this anyway. They tell them to keep their eyes out for Joker. So anyway, Joker goes to LeBlanc and we are introduced to Emma, the game's first plot device. Emma is basically Siri but much more evil. She also serves as how everyone is able to go in and out of the metaverse in this game. They all decided they want to go camping in order to start off their summer vacation, and that everyone should meet up tomorrow so they can do some shopping. That night, Joker goes to sleep and he sees Lavinza. Surprisingly, Igor isn't here and I really wonder why. She tells him that something is wrong and like usual, we are sent to handle it. So the next day they go shopping but are quickly interrupted when a girl starts talking about her new shop that is opening up. So this is Alice and she is going to be the very first villain of the game. In this game, the villains are called monarchs and they essentially replace the palace rulers. I do like how she looks like a hybrid between a human and a Publix bakery. Her design is very extravagant and I've always been a sucker for those type of character designs. So Alice gives us a card that has a keyword on it that lets us friend her on Emma. This is the second half of how we enter the metaverse. Upon entering the keyword, we find ourselves in a distorted version of Shibuya, where we witness regular people getting these little pink diamonds stolen from them. These are desires and that's the most basic description you're gonna get. If these are taken from someone, they lose all sense of reason and fall head over heels for the monarch who has their desires, in this case Alice. The guys start to fight their way around to see if they can find the ruler. They think this is a palace so they run straight to the castle and automatically get kidnapped. We meet Shadow Alice and she looks like this. It's kinda sad that she's the first monarch because if she had showed up later in the game then combat isn't the only thing that would have gotten harder. Anyway, she throws the guys into the dumpster and we end up meeting Kasumi's replacement for this game. Also, why didn't Alice just kill them? So yeah, this is Sophia, humanity's companion. She even fits the bill of being Kasumi. Red hair, messed up memory, and even in love with Joker. So you start to run through this JRPG sewer level as you pretty much go through a second tutorial of the game. It teaches you about vantage points, sneaking around, and all the other stuff. Stuff that I said you probably won't be using too much. Sophia also shows that she's capable of fighting down here. When you play as her, you'll also notice that each of her skills have a question mark at the end of them, which really should raise some questions about her. Before you leave, there's something else I want to point out that happens down here. First, you get another persona by picking up a mask, and getting masks in this game is rather tricky, because it feels like you have to hit the weaknesses in order to get these to spawn, but even with the bond skill that increases how frequently they spawn, it doesn't help that much. The only other feature that has changed, and I don't remember if this was in the base game, is that every shadow has level requirements. And I'm talking about for fusion here. The bad part about this is that sometimes it will ask for a certain shadow that you don't even use to be at a certain level. Like, who is going to have a level 50 Pixie in the late game? And this doesn't even account for the fact that there won't even be that many good fusions for the first 2 dungeons, or at least in my experience. The other thing that happens before you leave is a mini-boss with Bicorn. In this fight, you'll most likely get a Master Art. These are special skills needed to improve each character's moveset. I really don't have anything to say about them, I just thought it'd be important to bring it up. I will say that you might not be able to get everyone's Master Arts in one run. It may be because you may not play as everyone equally. I didn't get Morgana's or Ann's at all. After you leave the sewers, Sophia shows you the way out of the jail. She doesn't come back with you to the real world, and that's because she's basically an AI who remains within Joker's phone. You didn't head to LeBlanc to introduce Sophia to the rest of the Phantom Thieves and explain what you saw in the metaverse. So let's get Sophia out of the way. There will be numerous times throughout the game to where she will talk to you and wonder more about the human heart because she doesn't have one herself. As you probably know, these dialogue options don't really change much, but it is fun to interact with this character. I also love how she'll hum to herself every now and then.
She's humming to herself?
After this, they all decide to do some investigation on Alice. This is where you have to go around the city and talk to people to learn more about the Monarch. In Alice's case, people are sipping for her so hard that they are either spending their entire life savings to buy her merch or leaving their lovers. Something that we actually see in the next scene when we watch her go on stage. In this scene, we also see her abusing her manager, and I have never wanted to be an NPC in a video game so hard in my life until I saw this. I guess I'll just have to wait for Resident Evil 8. So the thieves go into the jail and decide to head for the castle. By being smart, they take the side route of the castle by realizing there are large spotlights in front of the castle. However, the side path has more spotlights with machine guns that will shoot them when they get close. This starts the trend of every single jail. There's a hazard, you gotta disable it. The game puts this in the form of prison keeps around each jail. These are small battle arenas that will have you either fighting a mini-boss or a large group of enemies. All before you can climb the tower and grab a small item that will allow you to move forward. The items that you grab are related to the monarchs and act as the treasures from the last game. After you clear each prison keep, Alice puts a large door in front of her castle and then a bunch of enemies spawn. This is where they say that they should leave for the day and come up with a plan, and this really confuses me, because all of the Phantom Thieves are here, and they say that they can't just fight this fucking group of enemies by themselves? In the next scene, Joker fights that large group all on his own. They all could have just joined in and fought them at this very moment right now. Anyway, I guess they had to do that so we can introduce Akechi's replacement. So yeah, this is Enkichi Hasegawa, and he's a lot cooler than Akechi if you ask me. He tells the Phantom Thieves that the police are onto them and that he wants to strike a deal because he believes the Phantom Thieves are not the ones behind the change of heart epidemic. I also love how Haru speaks to Zenkichi here.
Sorry about that. We just despise the police is all.
It's kind of weird when you say it with a smile like that.
Anyway, the group decides if they should trust the old man or not. But first they warn her about getting past the large door. Joker is essentially forced to fight the entire group of shadows by himself. After the battle, they head straight for the castle where you do some small puzzles of touching these statues in the right order, then the first of many elevator fights. These are pretty much like the prison cubes, but they essentially have the chance to last a bit longer than normal. Another one later on has a timer for you for how long you need to last, and I wonder if this could have been gone a different way by needing to kill all the enemies before the timer runs out. Once they make it to the top, they find a giant birdcage with a lock. Then Ryuji jumps forward, but is stopped when something blocks his path, and he hears something from Alice's past. This is the other new feature of the jails. Happen to find something called trauma cells in the real world in order to open up these bird cages. Zenkichi is the one who helps them by telling them that Alice went to the same school as them, which is where the trauma cell is located. Here you fight a special enemy called a warden, who has his own moveset and weaknesses. They are pretty fast and can teleport. The interesting thing is that they have the same weaknesses as the bosses. The bosses that are connected to them at least, so you at least know who to take for the full battle. But that's quite an issue, because you won't know that until you get here. After this, they send a calling card to fight Alice, so if you play through the whole jail with someone who doesn't have the element Alice is weak to, then you're kinda fucked. Not entirely, but it makes the battle much longer when you can't hit their weaknesses. So like I said, rather this is the Alice fight. She turns into a giant rabbit and starts attacking us. Now she doesn't have the same problem as other bosses who have a wide area of effect for her spells because her attacks always come at a good pace for you to know what's happening. Plus attacks are always displayed before they happen just so you know to prepare. All in all, this is a great boss to start the game with. My only minor issue is that these bosses had a little less health. This is something that you'll notice on everyone. The way that health drains in this game is very weird. The first few hits will barely do anything, whereas it feels like the enemies start to melt under your attacks when they're below 20% health. With Alice having her heart changed, the Phantom Thieves now wonder about Zenkichi, who asks about the deal. They reluctantly agree and bring him into the jail. He takes it wonderfully. So with their deal in place, he tells them that they are investigating someone in Sapporo on August 8th and asks them to meet him there. So this is what I meant when I said that you will be going from city to city. Sojiro continues to be a badass and he gets you an RV and then you hit the road towards Sapporo. This is where Sophia tells you that she can smell gels whenever they come across one, which is what happens when you get close to Sendai. They all stop because Yusuke wants to see a statue of an old samurai. This is where they see posters for some light novel called Prince of Nightmares. They take them down and then they head for a restaurant. This is where we are introduced to the third best girl in all of Persona 5, Kuon Ichinose. There isn't much to learn about her except for the fact that she talks a lot. However, since she has her own bus graphic, it's pretty obvious that you'll be seeing her more in the story. Anyway, once they leave the restaurant, they run into Angu Natsume. Once this guy opened up his mouth, the first thing I said to myself was, man, I really miss Akechi. Anyway, he's the monarch of this city, and the deal with him, which you find out during the investigation, is that he's the grandson of a famous writer. His current series, Prince of Nightmares, which we saw in those flyers, is selling like the PlayStation 5. It's the same situation with Alice. People are going crazy over him, spending too much money, simple stuff. However, the team realizes that if he's just that good of a writer, then all of this is completely justified, but then Yusuke buys the book and says that the book has no life to it. Then the team finds out that he is pretty much plagiarizing other writers. I think there was even something like that was brought up during the investigation. So now it's time to get inside of his jail. What really messes with me is how the team gets his keyword. Yusuke goes up to him and pretends that he's a fan, and his keyword is literally Prince of Nightmares, which none of these dumbasses were able to figure out. Like, what other option could there have been? So when they enter the jail, the same formula repeats from the last one. However, this one essentially tries to take the idea of being very cliche because Natsume's book is seen as very cliche. So you have to fight these four dumbasses called the Fearsome Four that essentially guard every single prison keep. After this, you go and find Natsume's trauma room, which is inside of a coffee shop in Sendai. This is where we learn that Natsume's editor used him for money because Natsume wasn't good enough as a writer. Despite all his efforts, he found it hard to grow and they decided that his name was more important than the quality of his work. As someone who writes, I can relate to that. They're trying to get better, not someone using my name. I'm just some nobody with a YouTube channel. The Natsume battle is where I think players have to learn one thing: status ailments. and it doesn't work as well as you think it does. They tell us to use the ice pillars in the arena in order to freeze Natsume, which will allow us to use physical attacks for technical damage. Now, technical damage works the exact same way as enemies who are weak to a certain element, but it's very inconsistent, or I just don't fully understand it. You can spend all of your stamina trying to put an enemy into a burn state and it won't happen. But one fire spell from them and you're pretty much lighting up like they doused you with gasoline beforehand. Other than that, this battle is pretty standard. It has a lot of spells and I don't know what some of them even do. Like Futaba would tell us to essentially watch out for Natsume casting his spell, but nothing ever really happens. Before we move on, there's one last thing I want to talk about. It happens here and I forgot to mention it back in the Alice section. After they confess, Zenkichi interrogates both of them and gets their cell phones so Futaba can figure out how they're connected to the metaverse. She doesn't find anything, but does say that she found traces of someone snooping on Alice and Natsume. I'll bring this back in a minute. So the next day, the thieves are essentially asked to head up to the university and sit in on a lecture. The person doing the lecture is the guy who runs the company that controls Emma, a company named Medice and their CEO Tony Stark. They really don't learn anything during this lecture. However, Ichinose appears and finds out that they are actually the Phantom Thieves because they won't shut their fucking mouths. Then in the next scene, she tells them that she is the one who made Emma, and that she sold it to Medice because she needed some money. And no one on the team starts to wonder if these pieces are connected. Instead, we are tasked with sending this woman junk that we find inside of the jails. No one sits back and asks, I wonder if Ichinose may have a hand in how Emma is being used to change people's hearts. The next section is in a city called Sapporo, and I'm not a fan of this level. Mostly because I find it boring compared to everything else that we've done so far. And I would say that the game picks up pretty quickly right after this and has one amazing level, despite all but one of the jails after this being incredibly short. So they head for Sapporo and decide to go to a bathhouse, where they meet up with Zenkichi and he tells them about their target, a woman named Mariko Hyodo who is the mayor of Sapporo. Apparently her popularity has risen drastically and the police want to know if she has any connection to the change of heart epidemic. So the next day they go to the mayor's office, and right there they find her chewing out one of her employees over some wilted flowers. And just from seeing this one scene they go into full investigation mode and try to find out more about her. Also, I forgot to mention that she knows Haru's dad because they used to be friends a long time ago. Which, by the way, if you haven't picked up on it, every single jail seems to follow one of the Phantom Thieves so far. The first one was about An, the second one was about Yusuke, and this one is about Haru. What I will say is that Haru doesn't get that much more character development in this game as opposed to the last one, but she isn't awful. Anyway, you start to investigate, and I think this is the shortest one. It's weird because the people here are just showing a sense of gratitude towards Mariko. And unlike Alice and Natsume, none of the people who have had their desires taken are doing anything awful. The Phantom Thieves just see it as bad because the people are gushing over Mariko so harshly. And I don't mean harsh in the way of being evil, I just mean that they're doing it a lot. So anyway, we go over to a speech that she's giving and we get her keyword from there. This jail is my least favorite because it feels like a bunch of wasted potential. The entire objective is about removing these large walls of ice so you can proceed, even though you just climb over one near the end of the jail. Another mechanic is how a blizzard will appear after you clear the first prison keep. You have to turn off individual heaters in order to calm it, and I honestly thought this was going to be used more. Like the blizzard could probably spawn some really powerful enemies that you have to fight until you turn the heater off. Anyway, after clearing all the prison keeps, we start to climb the castle, and at the top something new happens. We get our first boss encounter with two large shadows. This is another one of those things that I wish was done more in the game. I can only think of one other instance to where you fight two large shadows like this, in the last jail. It's a real shame because I think one of these Monarch battles could have essentially used multiple enemies. So anyway, after this we have to go and find her trauma room. This one is based around how a few years ago there was a statue that was built for the Snow Festival and it eventually fell over and killed a little girl. This is because the men who work for Mariko had ordered cheaper construction so they can keep more money in their own pockets. She takes all responsibility for it because she's the mayor, but the guys who essentially called for the cheaper construction and made the statue fall essentially tried to take her down. And honestly, I'm way more sympathetic towards Mariko after this. Like, I don't even really see her as a villain, I just see her as someone trying to help her city. Which you may have noticed is kind of the theme that all of the monarchs are following. They aren't really even bad people, they're more like just victims of their trauma, and they're using the metaverse to change hearts in order to deal with that trauma. This in itself is one of the biggest differences from Persona 5. So we finally get inside of her boss room and she looks like this. And I have to be honest, but I fucking hate this design. Like, to be honest, I was expecting something more like Queen Yarnum from Bloodborne or the White Witch from Narnia. Because with the jail being a large snow city, I would have expected something that at least fits that theme. Hell, by that metric, we could have essentially gotten a Wendigo. Especially considering the fact that the jail is based around gluttony. But no, we get this fucking Ursula ripoff who just eats a lot. Probably the most unsubtle thing ever. Her boss form is even worse. Anyway, her battle has a lot of large sweeping attacks. She's very fast and will knock you down in an instant with every single attack that she does. However, what happened on my first run of this fight is that I kept spamming spells to the point to where she never got a chance to do anything else. Like, one of her abilities lets her eat one of the party members, and all you need to do is just drop one of the large chandeliers on her in order for her to spit them out. Or I think you can also trigger it if you just deal enough physical damage to her. Her other ability allows her to summon the giant blizzard that you saw earlier, and you still need to just turn off a heater in order to make it go away. If I'm being honest, this is probably the worst fight in the whole game. So after the snow-covered shitfest, you essentially spend your last night in Sapporo by taking someone to the Ferris wheel, and I made the only acceptable choice. After this, it's time to take a quick peek inside of the life of Zenkichi. This starts with Ichinose calling us and saying that after she sold Emma to Mediz, it was shipped off to a research facility in Okinawa. So we all decide to go there, and Zenkichi recommends that we all stop in Kyoto first. Along the way, he drives the Federmobile, and we get a great scene developing him a bit more. If you were following the game long before its release, then you already knew he was going to be playable. But these scenes with him about how he explains how tough his job is, but he still manages to pull through, are surprisingly great. Halfway through this, he receives a phone call from someone. So anyway, Joker answers the phone, and when this person started talking about going to Mom's grave, I thought it was actually Zenkichi's sister. That idea was shattered in the next scene when it turns out to actually be his daughter. She ends up getting mad at him during the phone call because she hears the other girls talking in the background. The thieves all go to apologize and explain that it was all just a big misunderstanding. Then they all decide to crash at Zenkichi's house. I think this is my favorite scene in the entire game, every single part of it. Meeting Akane, going to Zenkichi's house, cooking dinner, finding out she's the biggest fangirl in the entire world, and learning that she has a crush on Joker. Also, she's basically doing what Alice was doing, but much better. Then there's the final scene where she talks to Makoto, and Makoto explains how much Zenkichi actually loves her. Before this, the story didn't really give me anything to love, but once I got here, everything changed for the better. There are a few more great scenes after this, by the way. Anyway, the team heads for Okinawa after this, and I think this is probably the best looking non-metaverse location in the entire game. This is something that I kind of wish flows over into the next Persona game. I hope that it's kind of like a half open world game. Just give us more beautiful locations to explore. So the point of coming here is to explore the research facility, which we find out is closed until the next day. So the group decides to hang out and just go to the beach for a little bit. It's a fairly short scene and nothing else really happens. Well, except for the fact that Zenkichi gets turned into a mermaid. Actually, I take it back, Zenkichi is now the third best girl in the game. So the crew is attacked in the middle of the night, and I don't really know how to talk about this. It's just something that you have to see. They head for the research facility with the belief that everyone on the island has had their hearts changed. They end up finding another jail, and it's really small. And I mean like really small. There's only like 2 checkpoints here and maybe about like 5 rooms. This also starts the trend of there not really even being a way for you to go and explore and buy anything anymore. And your only option is to just go through the jail. Anyway, while in the jail, you find 3 Silent Hill-like recordings. These apparently belong to the monarch of the jail that is now dead. If there is one thing I want to nitpick about this jail, is just how you move through it. There are all these windows around and you can't even hit them to break them. You have to actually perch up next to them and then actually move through it. And these hooks are kind of alright, but it's not fun to wait for them. Anyway, the recordings from the monarch pretty much tell you that he was afraid of getting his heart changed by the person he was working for. Also, since this jail doesn't even have a monarch, we don't even get a boss fight here. We just fight a warden. Also, I should point out that before all this, some weird voice was talking to Sophia, and like, it should just be completely obvious who the fuck this is. And even if it isn't, let me just tell you that it's Emma. So with that jail done, we essentially go into the research facility and we find a flash drive that has a bunch of names on it. All of the people on his list were targets for changes of heart, including those 2 councilmen from Sapporo. One person on his list essentially catches Zenkichi's eye and he keeps it to himself for a bit. This person is named Owada, and he's the person responsible for killing Zenkichi's wife. Owada was drunk and it was in a hit-and-run accident. Akane knows this and she's mad that Zenkichi won't arrest him. Owada isn't that great of a villain, by the way, but he does give Zenkichi more motivation as a character. So Zenkichi leaves and he takes the list to his bosses. Then the thieves leave and they all go to an entirely different city to eat. Yes, Zenkichi calls them and says that he might have figured out who's behind the change of heart epidemic. So Haru goes into full Lightning McQueen mode and almost kills the team to get them back to Kyoto. So yeah, Zenkichi believes that Owada is the one behind the change of heart epidemic. And after taking one good look at him, the thieves completely believe him. I mean, knowing this series' track record, he might as well have been. Yet it turns out that it's actually not Owada who's the one responsible for the jails. It's actually Konoe, remember Agent Tony Stark? Also, remember how I pointed out how the monarch of Okinawa essentially committed suicide? Well, if you played these games for any amount of time, then you know what's going to happen next. So Zenkichi leaves the team inside of a high-end resort in Kyoto. Right after this, we see Zenkichi's boss getting ordered by Owada to arrest the Phantom Thieves. Konoe then gets on live television and lies about the Phantom Thieves trying to hack Emma. He also announces that Emma will be taken offline until the Phantom Thieves are dealt with. And I guess everyone just goes along with this, especially considering the fact that the Phantom Thieves were also accused of something before, which also turned out to be untrue. So anyway, Makoto beats up the guys in the bathhouse, and then the resort is surrounded by the police. Zenkichi shows up and he tries to protect the thieves and ends up getting arrested himself, proving once again that he is the best girl of this game. The thieves head back to Zenkichi's underground hideout and they try to come up with a plan. However, they receive a message from Akane saying that they kidnapped Akane. Kinda weird, but okay. So they decide to go and rescue her only to get forced into another jail. What's really weird about this is that all of them know this is a fucking trap, yet every single one of these dumbasses runs headfirst into this jail to save this fucking jailbait. So now the weakest, but somehow still more useful than Morgana, Phantom Thief, doesn't get captured while the rest of the dumbasses are trapped inside of a cage. But can't they just like break these bars? I mean, Yusuke is a swordsman and Ryuji can hit shit really fucking hard. Like, Joker's doing shit like this in the beginning of the game, yet they can't break through a fucking cage. So anyway, Futaba goes back to the real world and she ends up meeting with Zenkichi. So the way that Zenkichi got out of police custody is because of Sai. And her inclusion in this game is a lot more weirder than Igor's. Because we hear her and we see her bus graphic, but we don't see her model. That's strange. Anyway, Futaba brings Zenkichi back into the jail so they can try to save the rest of the dumbasses. And you get a pretty interesting section where you have to play Zenkichi to sneak past some shadows without the use of her persona. Anyway, the second best scene in the game is about to happen right now. So yeah, if you didn't know, Akane is actually the monarch of this jail. Zenkichi admits to being a terrible father and how he actually wants to stop Owada, but there are people way more powerful than him stopping him. This is where he reveals that he actually did try to do some investigation, but he was told that if he didn't stop, that his daughter would die. After this, Zenkichi awakens to his persona, and it's fucking awesome. The eyes from Valjean appearing over his shadows is just so fucking cool, and I can't get enough of it. And now that I think about it, based on the way that things work in this game, Zenkichi could have actually been the monarch of this jail instead of Akane. So Akane runs away and the thieves leave so Zenkichi can rest up after awakening his persona. This jail is also really short, just like the Okinawa jail. It also has the same problem as the Okinawa jail, to where you don't have an area to explore so you can buy items. The jail has one interesting mechanic of teleporting you around to random places on the map. It's a pretty fun idea and may be the reason why the jail is so small. So your main objective is to get to Akane by opening up this statue. The teleporters aren't completely random as they will take you to a certain room and you just gotta remember where exactly to go. Anyway, after this you get to one of the most insane battles in the entire game. You have to fight an evil version of yourself. The sad part about this fight is that it's not actually a battle where you essentially cycle through all of the Phantom Thieves, but realizing exactly how Haru plays, that would have been a fucking nightmare. This fight is pretty great, but one really weird thing happened to me during my battle. Basically, the evil Joker essentially stopped attacking and only dodged my attacks for like 90% of the battle. He wasn't invincible, all I had to do was essentially get him into a corner and essentially just keep attacking him, or pull off a Showtime attack. I have to say that I still really did like it because I had to essentially move around way quicker than I did for any other fight in the game. So even though this was a weird glitch, it was still an overall great fight. And it's really sad that this is the only fight in the game that you actually can't do twice. Once the battle's over, we get a pretty heartwarming scene with Zenkichi after he sees Akane die. Okay, she doesn't actually die, but this is still a pretty great scene. What makes it even worse is that they essentially tell him that everything is fine after he starts crying. That's pretty fucked up, but whatever, I guess. So now we're heading towards the supposed finale of the game. I say supposed because everyone knows the game is not going to end here. So they head to Osaka to try to take on Konoe. However, they need his keyword in order to get inside of the jail. So they call Ichinose and she has the ability to give it to them, but she says that she'll call them tomorrow when she finds it. So Osaka has pretty much the largest shopping area in the entire game, and I recommend that while you're here you just go ahead and stock up on everything. Because this is the largest jail in the entire game and it's kind of a slog. Also by now, anything that doesn't heal more than 30 HP is pretty much useless. This jail is a bit of a slog because all it does is just recycle concepts. You have the giant machine guns with spotlights, just like in Shibuya. You have buttons you need to press in order to open up color-coordinated doors, just like in Sendai. And right when you get to the castle, you have to leave because there's a giant event going on, just like what happens in Sapporo with the He-Horde. I will say that this jail has probably the best array of enemies to fight. It's what I said earlier about dealing with multiple groups of different types of enemies. But this jail isn't awful by any means, I just wish it was a bit more colorful. I mean, the fucking final boss is a goddamn Power Ranger. Couldn't it have been a bit more weird? Konoe's trauma is a lot more interesting. His father was very abusive and killed his own wife over some money. He was planning on doing the same to Konoe before Konoe killed him. Now this guy gives off the exact same vibe that the councilman back in Sapporo gave. But Konoe himself is also enough of a villain that you would still want to take him down. I wish that all the other jails had went off the same basis as this one. I get that they wanted to make the other monarchs a bit more sympathetic, but they could have made them a bit more villainous. I don't know, none of them were really awful except for the Sapporo section, so it may not have worked as well as I think it would. I've already spoken enough about the second phase of this boss fight, but the first phase is also pretty good. This robot has a lot of moves that feel very natural to react to, and he does have much more unique weapons within the battle arena that you can attack him with. This is probably the only other battle in the game besides the Alice one that had a great flow to it. When you weren't attacking, you were always either dodging or doing something else, and it never felt like you were being pushed away from the fight when you went on the defensive. Anyway, with Konoe defeated, the Phantom Thieves decided to regale and have their last celebration before going home. This concludes with a fireworks festival that they decide to go to. I also like in this scene how you can talk to each team member and they'll give you a special accessory. But just as everyone predicted, Zenkichi calls them and tells them to check the news. Emma is still online and people are actually now going crazy over it. The team all head for the Tokyo radio tower to where Emma's servers are located. So the team ends up inside of another jail. And this one looks a hell of a lot like Mementos from the last game, which scared me because I realized how long Memento was in the last game and I thought it would be a repeat of that here. But no, this one is actually really short. And yeah, like I said earlier, this one has a lot of large battles with different types of enemies. Anyway, you eventually come to a large room where you find the Ark of the Covenant. And it was at this moment that I realized that they were basically copying themselves from the ending of the last game. And yeah, this thing is pretty much Emma. An AI somehow gained sentience and became a physical being in the metaverse. Sound familiar? Well, if you don't know, Ichinose shows up and literally tells you that. So yeah, Ichinose was the one that made Sophia. She also says that she was the one who was spying on the monarchs. Now the reason that Ichinose ended up creating Sophia is because she wanted to learn about the human heart. She states that she herself has no heart, and that she's just a lifeless doll who essentially doesn't have any emotion. And I think the game completely missed the chance of having a monarch that could have been like that. Anyway, Ichinose pretty much activates Order 66 and has Sophia kill the Phantom Thieves. So anyway, you can't even win this battle because Sophia will pretty much take no damage. And since she realizes that she's overpowered now, she sacrifices herself because she doesn't want to kill her friends. Then Ichinose summons a giant crystal to teleport the Phantom Thieves away right to where Sophia is. Which is really strange to me. Like, if you had this crystal, why did you just use it automatically? And why does it teleport them instead of just straight up kill them? Actually, that's a really weird thing that I've been trying to wrap my head around. Why does everyone try to kill the Phantom Thieves inside of the metaverse? Like, they have superpowers and you don't. What the fuck are you going to do? So anyway, you go through a really short section in order to get back to Ichinose. You get into a pretty intense battle as Futaba tries to hack through Ichinose's barrier. Then she activates the crystal again and it shoots a giant laser that Sophia blocks. Anyway, the third best scene in the game happens when Sophia awakens to her persona. This is really surprising because, well, I didn't think she was actually going to get one. So anyway, an even larger battle breaks out and Futaba manages to break through the shield. After the battle, Sophia has a heart-to-heart with Ichinose. She manages to change her heart without ever really fighting her, which is something that I wish was done a lot more in the game. It could have been a mixture of how it's done in Persona 4 and in Persona 5. We get to change of heart and a great boss battle. I also think this would have been the best idea considering the fact that Ichinose doesn't even get arrested after this. And now it's time for the final jail, and it's really fucking short. Emma merges the metaverse with the real world and now you have to climb the radio tower in order to finish her off. This jail has like 4 really short floors and another dual boss battle. The only thing that's exciting here is the fact that this place is cramped with enemies. I think the jail could have been a lot better if this had just been a large string of boss battles. Like every potential shadow that is here could have just showed up in their boss form, which is exactly what Yatagatsuru does. And now it's time for the final boss. The one word I was used to describe this final boss is slow. This fight has 3 phases. The first one has you dodging moves that Futaba will direct you on. You run away from a bunch of lasers that are coming from you in 2 separate directions, then a bunch of homing lasers, and then move to the next area in order to evade an AoE attack. You hit the Demiurge over and over again, but it doesn't really react to your attacks. The only time it does is when it opens up its wings and you knock them back. The second phase has you sending party members to handle its balls, and I'm not gonna laugh after that joke. These have the same problem as some of the other bosses. Each of these have their own weaknesses, and if you don't pick the right people for the right team, then you won't be able to knock them down quickly. Also, a warden can be summoned on both sides as a regular enemy, something that I wish happened more in the other jails. The last phase has you fighting it in full God mode, but now it has a bunch more physical and magical attacks. It also has one move that requires you to move around the entire arena in order to evade it. I don't have footage of it, but I believe that if you aren't level appropriate to fight this boss, this attack is an instant kill. And that's the final boss. The final cutscene of the battle shows the Phantom Thieves attacking together and defeating the Demiurge, which really makes me wish that there was just some full Phantom Thieves all-out attack screen. Anyway, after this, everyone goes home and it's time to say goodbye to Joker. But not before Ichinose calls the whole team up and asks them to meet. She explains that she wants to take her own journey of self-discovery in order to find her own heart, and Futaba manages to transfer Sophia over to Ichinose so they can do it together. Also, one more thing I want to point out. If you're still wondering how Sophia ended up in the Shibuya jail, it's explained that Ichinose sort of just left Sophia in Shibuya, which somehow means that she ended up in the Shibuya jail? I really don't fucking get it, but hey, it's an answer. And that's it. That's the full story of Persona 5 Strikers. There were some small pieces that I skipped over because I didn't deem them too important, but I got all the major pieces out of the way. It's definitely a great experience, and will satisfy anyone who's a fan of these characters and this world. If you really think about all the negative things I had to say about this game, it's really that I just wish there was more of this game. Or at least just more of Persona 5. I didn't really know how to end this video, but that's kind of the point. I don't want Persona 5 to end. I love these characters and this world so much that I want to see them go on forever. But that's not how anything works. I guess all I have to do now is wait for Persona 6. Which is something I actually hope is a lot more like this game instead of being turn-based. Maybe it will and maybe it won't. We'll just have to wait and see. But I think it's time for all of us to go our separate ways with Persona 5.
Until next time, Phantom Thieves.